One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I think probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mom in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept, and now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to get on the bus. School started at 8 a.m., and my bus pickup time was 7 a.m., but I was already like 6:40 or something, and I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even had breakfast yet. So my mom decided that today, we would just tell the school bus driver to go on ahead and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there at the dining room table eating my breakfast, still in my pajamas, and it's now about 6:50. We hear the bus pull up about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She does closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. There's a knock at the door. My mom opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular driver called in sick. He says he knows he's a few minutes early since he wanted to get an early start on the routes and he doesn't know it too well. Mom explains to him that she was going to take me to school since we both woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says that he can wait a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mom insists that no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast and still don't have my school clothes on at this point, but at 7 a.m. sharp, another bus pulls up to my house. Mom thinks this is weird and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about this and tells me to finish getting ready for school. At that time, I didn't know what had happened, but Mom would end up telling me a few years later. When she went to this second bus, she found that it was driven by my regular bus driver, and it was full of the other kids that usually rode on my route. The other bus was empty, by the way. Mom asked the driver about the substitute driver and about him calling in sick. I never called in sick, and there is no substitute driver on my route, he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go inside and call the police, which she did without me knowing, and reported the incident. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again, not even if someone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, had I gotten on that bus, I would have never made it to school or back home. And if my mom didn't oversleep that on that specific day, I would have been on that bus. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everyone loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in his father and had a talk with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad was playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day, Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know that he was going to fire him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person.
As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him, despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he would deal with it in the morning. Stanley was so furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices my grandfather included and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset, was hysterically crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead. And what was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he would never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a list of the people that he was going to kill and all the addresses of those that he had retrieved when he was searching the office. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would never met my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died. So Stanley, I'm glad we never had to meet, and you were stopped before you can cause more harm.
So this happened a few years ago. This didn't directly happen to me, but something almost happened to my youngest sister. I have 2 sisters. I think this was when I was a junior or senior in high school. The elementary school is where most events are held. It's close by the high school. The track and the soccer fields are right next to it, and right behind it is the playground. I remember it being a kind of a colder night. My middle sister, who at the time was 14 or 15, and I were playing in a soccer game. The game went on as normal. The game ended, and I remember there being a commotion amongst the parents. Some man was hanging around the playground. My mom was freaking out because she couldn't find my little sister, who at the time was around 9 or 10. She was supposed to be on the playground with some of her friends. A bunch of the older high schoolers went over to scare the man off and look out for the other kids on the playground and warn them. Some of the parents began to go into full panic mode. Some of the adults went over there as well. The high schoolers found something disturbing. They found the man jerking off in one of the slides. They quickly rounded up all the kids and got them back. The police were called, but the man left. For the next week, people kept seeing him hanging around the track. He would hang out in the evenings and nights. I can't remember if the police got him or not. I hope they did. I don't even want to imagine what would have happened if somebody didn't find those other kids and my youngest sister. I hope to God nothing like this ever happened again.